Welcome back to the Cut Off podcast. We have explored the human side of what it truly feels like when your role as a parent is severed by something invisible and profoundly misunderstood. And we've recognized that millions live this painful reality. In our first episode, Marisa bravely shared the raw, emotional truth of her personal journey. And now in episode 2, we move from the emotional experience to providing much needed clarity. Many of our listeners are navigating immense confusion, desperately searching for answers to what's happening to them. And today we are able to give that experience a name. Marisa, how do you define parental alienation? And why do you describe it as a widely misunderstood and unrecognized form of child and domestic abuse? Even a silent devastation.
Thanks for asking that, Susanna. I would describe it as what happens is what occurs that characterizes parental alienation specifically is when one parent damages or disrupts a child's relationship with the other parent purposefully. This isn't because the parent who is suffering the alienation is guilty of abuse or neglect, but what happens is through manipulation, coercion, and subtle messaging, the child is turned against them. It's not simply a case of choosing sides or what happens during a contentious custody dispute. It really is a form of psychological abuse and warfare against that parent and also against the child. The child, of course, does not realize this. The tragedy is that it's widely misunderstood. Courts, schools, even extended families often minimize it because there aren't really visible bruises or obvious evidence. But what I can say is the harm is very much real. The child loses access to a loving parent. They start internalizing distorted beliefs and often carry lifelong wounds around their self-identity. And it affects the trust they have in future relationships. The alienated parent, they end up grieving a living child. And it's really hard to describe that if you've never experienced it. But I would say it's an exceptionally profound form of loss. I've characterized it as a silent devastation because it quietly destroys families while leaving very little proof behind. Like other forms of domestic abuse, it thrives in secrecy, shame, and misunderstanding. And that's why awareness matters so much, because naming it for what it is, child abuse and family violence, really, it's the first step to protecting children and helping families heal.
Thank you, Marisa. And can I ask you this way, what is parental alienation not? And how does it differ from a typical messy divorce or a high conflict custody dispute, for example?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question because I think often, especially during contentious divorces or separations, perhaps you don't want to label it. You don't want to just anytime there's a child caught in the middle with in disagreement, you don't want to automatically assume that's parental alienation. Parental alienation is something much more severe. It's not a child simply being upset with a parent because of discipline, because there's a difference in personality, or because of normal developmental changes. It's also the natural tension. It's also not the natural tension that occurs during a divorce or even friction of two parents who struggle to co-parent well. Children can have preferences and divorces can be messy, but that doesn't automatically mean alienation is taking place. So what distinguishes parental alienation is the intentional and persistent effort by one parent to sever or severely damage the child's bond with the other parent. In high conflict custody disputes, both parents may argue, but the child is still usually allowed to maintain relationships with both parents. So with alienation, one parent will manipulate the child to reject the other, and often using tactics like rewriting family history, instilling fear in the child, and forcing the child to take sides. This is done subtly over time and almost on a daily basis in some situations. Whenever the topic of that parent comes up, often that parent will persistently plant a negative seed about that about that parent in the child's mind. So what I'll say is the difference is this. Conflict is between parents. Alienation recruits the child into the conflict. So a typical divorce, the child might feel caught in the middle, but can still love both parents. But however, with parental alienation, the child is pressured to erase one parent from their heart and really then their identity. And that's what makes it a form of abuse, not just conflict.
It's really a calculated activity there. You've mentioned that children affected by it present behaviors that are completely uncharacteristic to their prior relationship, making them seem like strangers even. Can you give us a sense of what those changes look like?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. What I'll say is one of the most heartbreaking aspects of parental alienation is watching how dramatically a child's behavior and personality can shift. Children who were once loving, affectionate, and bonded with a parent, they might suddenly appear cold, hostile, and even distant, almost like overnight. Uh, what I'll say is, for example, a child who used to run into your arms might suddenly refuse hugs, avoid eye contact, or even show visible discomfort in your presence. They might parrot phrases or accusations that sound far too adult for their age, things they could only have heard of from the other parents. And that's something I experienced firsthand. Children might take a black or a white mindset approach, good or versus bad, with no gray or no in between. One parent is seen as really entirely being great, and the other is entirely bad, and there's no middle ground. And that's something that's a hallmark of parental alienation. And if you really look at it, it's so unrealistic of life. If someone who knows how to diagnose it and can recognize it, that's an obvious sign that they would pick up right away. You may also see a lack of guilt or empathy. A child who once cared deeply for your feelings might suddenly show indifference or even cruel rejection, as if they've been conditioned to suppress their love for you. It can feel as though your child's been replaced, like they're a stranger inhabiting the body of the child you once knew. I experienced that firsthand. My teenagers, someone had said to me, well, this could just be teenage rebellion. And it was so much more extreme than that, and it was uncalled for. It happened as soon as I chose to leave the marriage. So these changes, they're not just personality quirks or developmental phrases like rebellion. They're red flags of psychological manipulation, and they leave deep emotional scars for both the parent and the alienated child.
Yeah. And critically, how do we distinguish parental alienation from, for example, justified estrangement? You've emphasized that alienation involves manipulation, not a child's valid rejection based on actual abuse by the targeted parent.
Yeah, that's such a critical, important question because the term parental alienation is sometimes it's misused. We need to be clear as to what it is and what it's not. Parental alienation is not the same as justified estrangement. Justified estrangement happens when a child rejects a parent for valid reasons. For example, obvious reasons such as abuse, neglect, unsafe behavior from that parent, where the parent has seriously failed to meet the child's needs. And in those cases, the child's distancing is a form of self-protection, which makes sense. It may be painful, but it's based on real experiences of harm. Alienation, on the other hand, it's marked by manipulation and coercion. So the child rejects a parent who is previously loving and safe, not because of abuse or because the other parent had systematically undermined that bond. Because the other parent has systematically undermined that bond is why parental alienation is occurring. So the rejection comes with exaggerated or false complaints, black and white thinking, which I touched on a moment ago, and often language that seems rehearsed. So what I'll say is the key difference is in estrangement, the rejection is reality-based, and there should be proof behind that. In alienation, the rejection is manufactured, and that's why careful assessment really is essential by clinicians and people who have the power to forever change and impact that child and those parents' lives in the court system. We must always prioritize child safety, undoubtedly, but we also must recognize when a child has been pressured to erase a parent who did nothing to deserve it.
Yeah, this also leads in part of it to the next question. You also spoke about before about the feeling of not being able to control what is being said to your children, or the ultimatums that they were likely hearing behind closed doors. Can you describe that specific sense of powerlessness?
Yeah. When I talk about the feeling of not being able to control what was said behind closed doors, I can only describe it as a kind of a living nightmare. It feels like being on trial, but not being allowed in the courtroom. Stories about me were being told, judgments were being made, and I had no way to defend myself or show my child the truth. The powerlessness, as you had said, comes from knowing that love and years of shared memories can be erased in just a few whispered words. And those words are just repeated time and time again. I couldn't control what was said in the car ride home or at bedtime or in those conversations when I wasn't with my child and the other party was. And what I noticed too with both of my sons is I saw that reflected back in their eyes as time went on and the division between us only increased. The suspicion was amplified, and it feels like you're seeing a stranger where your child used to be. I used to be able to be very honest, to be myself, and my children were able to be themselves, and we were able to have honest conversations, the normal relationship between a parent and child, and that all changed. And it's something that I don't think any parent can predict, or really, there's not a lot of guidance as far as how that parent is supposed to navigate that and best handle that with your child when all of a sudden they're being coerced to stop loving you, stop trusting you, and stop respecting you. For me, it was a unique kind of grief because I'm grieving a child who's still alive, but who's no longer remembers you as you really are. So what I would say to people is imagine the person you love most, my children, they're suddenly believing that you're unsafe, you're unloving. Um, all of the past memories, all the vacations, everything we did together, it's like they're not allowed to bring that up or acknowledge that. And it's a devastation of parental alienation, where before we could have honest conversations, and I can't even bring up subjects we used to talk about all the time. What I'll say is, I'm here speaking about it because silence, it only feeds the abuse. So for me, I realized by naming it, by telling the truth, I reclaim some sense of power as to who I am and how I'm a mother of three. And what I can say is I can't control what was said behind closed doors, but I control the fact that my voice and the voice of so many parents and children will no longer be erased.
I'm sure, Marisa, that doing this podcast definitely empowers and gives voice and help and hope for many who are suffering this. In your view, Marisa, you view the impact of parental alienation also not just as a family issue, but as something with public health implications that can even become a generational crisis. Can you elaborate on those thoughts a little bit to give a broader sense of what consequences can be there?
Yeah, when I was experiencing this firsthand, it was very easy for me to be mired down in my own problems and really myopic with, it's still a challenge and a battle in my life, but uh, it was hard for me at times to see the bigger picture. But the more research I did to better understand the phenomena and help myself, I realized how this can very much be a generational crisis and a problem that often goes missed in our healthcare system. So, it's often dismissed as a family problem or a custody battle, but it really, in reality, it affects, the effects of it ripple out far beyond one household. So when children are cut off from a loving parent, it's not just the relationship between that parent and that child that suffers. It can impact their mental health, their development, and future relationships in profound ways, obviously. So research has shown that children who experience alienation, they might struggle with anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, substance abuse, and difficulty forming stable attachments. And I think it's not a stretch of an imagination to understand why that occurs. Because once they've been alienated, they learn that love's conditional, that trust is dangerous, and that rejecting one parent is the price of loyalty to the other. So those patterns, they don't just disappear when they grow up. They echo into adulthood. It shapes how they parent, how they become a partner to someone else, and even how they see themselves, whether they realize it or not. I'll say it's really why I view parental alienation as a public health issue. It creates a long-term trauma, not just for the immediate family members, but for society at large. Higher rates of mental illness, greater strain in healthcare systems, and there's an increased risk of generational cycles of alienation or estrangement. And of course, there's the erosion of the healthy family structures that takes place. So when you multiply this phenomena across thousands of families, it becomes a generational crisis. It's been estimated that 11 to 15% of children whose parents divorce suffer parental alienation in some form in the United States alone. So that's almost 4 million children a year where this is occurring for them. So they become alienated adults, these children, and they repeat the same patterns, the same dysfunctional patterns that they've learned. So unless we start naming this for what it is, and it's a form of child and domestic abuse, we really risk normalizing an epidemic of broken family bonds, untreated trauma, and lifelong emotional fraud and fallout. While it may start behind closed doors, its consequences spill far out into our schools, our healthcare systems, and our workplaces and our communities, whether we realize it or not. Addressing it, it's not just about protecting that one parent and that one child. It's about protecting the well-being of future generations.
Yeah, definitely so important to point that out as people raise their children and the next generation raises their children, and all these patterns, stick there and cause the generational trauma. But beyond the direct tactics, you also witnessed significant changes in your children's behavior. How did you come to understand the resist and refuse dynamics playing out with your own children? Where children are coerced or manipulated to refuse contact or show resistance toward a loving parent?
Yeah, let me think about that. So what I'll say is the term resist and refuse, as far as dynamics go, it gave me a language for something I was living, but didn't really fully understand at first. In my case, I noticed my children suddenly resisting contact with me. My middle son, who once texted me within an hour or called me or always picked up the phone, within an hour or within a month and a half of me leaving my ex-husband, he stopped answering texts, he stopped answering calls. And when he did, there was always someone in the background telling him to hang up on me. So not because of anything in our relationship. He did, of course, use some discord between myself and my ex-husband because he was living in the same house, but nothing that would account for him choosing not to talk to me anymore. And as a matter of fact, I have a phone history of him responding back to me as a normal child up until the point, of course, that the separation occurred. So what I'll say is, at first, what I experienced and the other parents that I've talked to have experienced that, there's subtle shifts that occur that are easily missed. It can be hesitation at transitions. It can be parroting little criticisms that sound far too adult. It can be just delayed responses with texts and calls. But what happens is over time, it escalates into outright refusal in extreme cases of parental alienation. Refusing visits, refusing phone calls, even showing anger or hostility toward me that was completely out of character for the bond we always had shared. What I came to understand is that this wasn't my children turning against me on their own. It was the result of repeated messages and pressure from the other environment, messages that created fear, guilt, or a sense that loving me was somehow being disloyal to my ex-husband. And that's the heart of the resist and refuse terminology, is the child isn't freely choosing to reject a parent. They're coerced, often in invisible ways, to distance themselves. For me, that realization, it was really heartbreaking because, it was clarifying, but I just felt, once again, to reiterate that sense of powerlessness, is I could not control what was being said to my sons, and when I wasn't there, and I can't control their behavior. But it helped me to see that rejection that was occurring. It wasn't about my failures as a parent. It was about the pressure that they were under. And it made me feel profoundly sad for them and scared for who they were, if this were to continue, how this is going to affect them and their future development. So ultimately, understanding that it gave me the strength to keep loving them. And even when they were pushing me away and insults were flying that just weren't true, I had to find it in myself to forgive them, because they were certainly, it was devastating to see, because it was almost if my children were indoctrinated into a cult.
And from the child's own perspective, what did you learn about the immense pressure they face? Can you explain those loyalty conflicts and emotional triangulation where a child is forced to choose sides?
Yeah, and emotional triangulation, that's something that's really subtle and insidious. And unless it takes a trained professional, I think, to recognize that. And it's something that happens gradually and it just amplifies over time. But one of the hardest truths I've had to face is that children who are alienated, they're rejecting a parent, but they're also being forced into a position that really no child should ever be forced into. They're caught in this loyalty conflict where if they express love or care for that parent, they feel like they're betraying the other. My daughter, who's 6, when I see her and she says she misses me, and I've asked her, I said, are you allowed to express that, with your father and his family? And she says, no, they'll get so angry. I can't talk about you. And it's an impossible bind for any child to have to keep that within themselves, to know that they can't speak about the other parent in that parent's presence. So from the child's perspective, the pressure is immense. No child should have to experience that. Imagine being told directly or indirectly that if you enjoy time with your mother or your father, that the other parent will then feel hurt and will feel upset. So a child absorbs those cues very quickly, and over time they learn that the safest way to survive is just to cut off or reject one parent, even if that goes against their own heart. When my daughter would get in the car with me during custody exchanges, she would cry initially, and I'd say, why are you upset? I've missed you. I'm so happy to see you. And she would say, well, when I go with you, mommy, daddy tells me that he'll miss me so much when I see you. And that was at 4. I mean, no child should have to live with that type of guilt. And again, that speaks to, I can't control what's being said when I'm not in her presence, but it completely ate me up inside. And it was very hard for me to know how to navigate that and how to soothe my daughter and at the same time control my emotions. But that's what I mean by emotional triangulation. The child's pulled into the middle of the parent's conflict, forced to take sides. So managing their emotions instead of simply being a child. So my daughter learned quickly that she can't talk about me or express missing me in front of my ex-husband or his family. And what happens is the result is that child doesn't just lose a parent. They lose the freedom to express themselves, to love that parent fully, and to feel safe in both homes. So I think when you really analyze it and look at it, it's an enormous psychological burden for any developing child to carry.
You also described a phenomenon called psychological splitting, where the child views one parent as entirely good and the other one as entirely bad, ignoring any nuanced reality. How did you witness that unfolding in your own family?
Yeah. So, and this is terminology that I was not aware of until I started researching parental alienation and experiencing it myself. But it's a defense mechanism that children use when they're under pressure. So in the context of parental alienation, it shows up when the child is pressured to see one parent as completely all good and the other as all bad. And there's really no room for any nuance in between. There's no gray area, no room for both parents to be human and imperfect, yet loving. So in my family, I watched this happen gradually. At first, there were small signs. My child would dismiss positive memories we used to share, and then it suddenly escalated. Suddenly, I was described in black and white terms as being completely unsafe, unloving, and even though that completely contradicted years of a close, nurturing relationship and a bond, over time, I was demonized in my child's eyes, even though I was the parent that spent the most of the time with them, taking them to practices. I was the one that worked less and had more time to raise my children, but I unfortunately never was someone who, I'll say, I wasn't a dominant force in the relationship. I wasn't a controlling parent. The other parent was. Um, but for me, what made it especially heartbreaking was that it erased the reality of what I knew took place. That everyday love, the consistency, the laughter, it was all just wiped away. And it was replaced with a distorted narrative. And my children weren't rejecting me because of who I was. They were forced into a framework where rejecting me felt like the only way that I believed that they could stay loyal to the good parent. And that's what psychological splitting does. It doesn't just distort the children's view of the parent, it fractures the child's own sense of self. So because a child is half of each parent, if they believe one parent is all bad, what does that say about the half of themselves that comes from that parent? So I would say it plants seeds of shame and confusion into that child that can last a lifetime, that the child really doesn't realize what's occurring, but undoubtedly, if it's not rectified, it has a strong likelihood of haunting the way they view themselves the rest of their lives.
And moving to a little bit to the legal system, you have realized that the legal system itself actually was being weaponized by using legal loopholes and false accusations to destroy your career and your relationship with your children. Can you explain how you came to understand this as a form of coercive control or domestic violence by proxy through the legal system?
Yeah, I mean, this was something that really was profound and extensively harmful for me, and in my case, and was a hallmark of severe parental alienation. So I'll say is I faced false legal allegations, not once, but twice. And it was devastating. My ex and his family knew that I was a nurse and am a nurse. So I was accused of child abuse falsely twice. And they did it in a manner where it would have destroyed my career too. It was shattering personally. It threatened my career, which is what their intent was, my reputation. And it had the ability to destroy my career, threaten my reputation, and my ability to protect my own children. Even those allegations were completely unfounded. The damage lingered for me psychologically and for my children. During that time, my ex even went as far as not allowing the system to basically assess how I interacted with my children. He wouldn't even allow, he and his family would not come to custody terms where I could be evaluated with my children. So there were weeks I went without seeing my toddler because he refused to even let the system evaluate us together. And that's what I began to see, the bigger pattern, that the legal system itself was being used as a weapon. It wasn't about justice. It was about control. And what happened was by filing false reports repeatedly, dragging me into the investigations and exploiting legal loopholes, my ex and his family could keep me on the defense, drain my financial resources, and do their best to try to erode my credibility. And this is what many professionals now call legal abuse or litigation abuse. It's a form of coercive control where the court system becomes another tool in the abuser's hands. And this is something that happened to me every chance he could get. He threw out allegations. If my daughter had a little scratch on her knee from falling in the gravel, I almost became paranoid that he would say that. They would say that something happened. It's a type of domestic violence by proxy, because instead of physical abuse, the weapon was paperwork. It was hearings. It was endless accusations. Each filing, each accusation, each allegation each legal loophole became another way to intimidate me, isolate me, and punish me as the targeted parent. And the cruelest part is, while you're fighting to clear your name, your children are still absorbing that message that there is an open investigation underway about their parent. And it makes them feel unsafe and unworthy. And what I came to understand is that coercive control, it doesn't stop when a relationship ends. What happened for me was it shipped form. I was in a very abusive and controlling relationship, and because he could no longer control that side, he found a new way to try to control me and quiet me and silence me. And it worked for an extended period of time. It absolutely did. It became a form of economic abuse for me because I was constantly in the need of a defense attorney. And for some parents, it manifests that control in forms of stalking. But for me and my ex and his family, they implemented weaponizing the legal system. So that was my experience. And I know I have spoken to a multitude of other parents where, unfortunately, they've experienced the same thing.
Yeah, it even sounds like it's also a deformation of character case also there.
It is, but that's something that's very hard to prove in the legal system.
You also shared in episode 1 that, hearing the term parental alienation from your attorney was validating, but also terrifying, because he explained that it's something family law attorneys see all the time, but it's something that's really hard to litigate and prove. And I guess this really speaks to a large systematic issue, right? So why do you think that parental alienation remains so widely unacknowledged and misunderstood in the legal and clinical settings? And what are these legal and clinical blind spots that you've identified? And why do you feel courts often ignore parental alienation?
Yeah, such a critical question to ask. If I'm recalling correctly, my attorney first used the terminology. I felt two things simultaneously: relief, because finally I had a name for what I was experiencing, and just terror, because I knew what they were capable of, and I knew the implications of what could occur. But he had told me, and immediately I realized through research that it's an incredibly hard thing to prove in court. And that was the first time I realized just how deeply flawed the system is in handling this issue. There are a few reasons why it remains so widely unacknowledged and misunderstood in the legal and the clinical setting. First, it's invisible abuse. And I've said this before, there's no bruises, there's no obvious evidence. So it occurs through subtle conversations, withheld information, body language, repeated negative narratives that are impressed upon your children. And by the time the damage shows up in the child's behavior, it looks like the child's choosing to reject that parent, and for valid reasons. So courts often take it at face value. Second, there's legal blind spots. So family courts, they're often overloaded, under-resourced, and pressured to resolve conflict quickly. They have a multitude of cases to go through each day. So judges might fall back on the idea that children have a right to be heard, and without recognizing when the child's voice has been manipulated. So they take what the children have to say at face value. And alienation, it's dismissed as just a high conflict divorce and the fallout from that. And these judges, they don't necessarily have the time or the interest to delve deep into why these children are saying these things. Another reason I found was there's clinical blind spots. So many therapists, custody evaluators, they don't have adequate training to distinguish between what alienation is and justified estrangement. In my case, with the professionals involved, they tried to justify estrangement, although the insults that were being hurled at me, there was absolutely no proof, no substantial proof to back up these claims. So without that clarity, the protective parent can be mislabeled as uncooperative, while the alienating parent appears calm and reasonable. And it creates a perfect storm where the true dynamics are missed and the alienation deepens. And if you think about it, if you're the alienated parent and you love your children, there's going to be times where you might appear a little irrational or sad or upset because of what's occurring. You're losing your children. And unfortunately, your presence of being, what can happen is you being upset or you being reactive, in my case, can be mistaken for being unstable psychologically. And that's something that people, they might assess you at face value as, well, you're too reactive, you're psychologically unstable, you're not a fit parent for this child. So I believe courts, they often ignore parental alienation because it requires a nuance, it requires time, and a specialized knowledge to recognize it. And our system, it's not designated for nuance. In the healthcare system or the legal system, it's not designed for nuance. It's designed for expediency. And children and families, they pay the price. I'll say until the legal and clinical professionals are trained to recognize it for what it is, it will remain minimized and misunderstood.
Yeah, it's a pity. I'm sure this podcast will also make a difference of raising awareness. You also, spoke about the failure of the DSM and the lack of clinical training amongst professionals. And specifically, you've observed the knowledge deficit in the healthcare system among highly educated professionals. Can you elaborate on how this impacts families?
Yeah. This took me some time to understand this dynamic. But one of the biggest barriers families face with parental alienation is that it's a cascading effect. It's because it's not formally recognized in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And this is the manual that clinicians use. So without that recognition, therapists, doctors, and child protective workers, they don't have a clear framework for identifying it for what it is. They're trained to look for anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and abuse, but they're not trained to spot the unique patterns of parental alienation. So because of this lack of clinical training, it creates this dangerous gap. Families come to professionals for help, such as myself, but instead of identifying alienation, the child's rejection of a parent might be taken at face value, or worse, that the targeted parent might be blamed as being difficult or uncooperative, or too reactive or emotionally unstable. But if you think about it, if you're a parent and your children are being stripped away from you and you're being misunderstood, there's a high likelihood you're not going to be very emotionally sound in that moment. What I'll say is I'm personally seeing highly educated professionals, doctors, therapists, even legal guardians, completely misunderstand what's happening. And their misunderstanding, it deepens the alienation and it just perpetuates the harm. So the absence of training, what that means is interventions, they're often misapplied. The therapist might try reunification therapy without addressing the manipulation. And therapists are trained to listen and validate a child's emotions, but what they don't realize is if they're not clinically trained to recognize parental alienation when it's occurring, all they're going to do is validate those child's emotions and their feelings, but they don't realize that those feelings and emotions are subsequent from the manipulation that they're experiencing from the alienating parent. So it just re-traumatizes. So when children go through the system, whether it's therapy, traditional therapy, and they're seeking support from a clinician that doesn't understand this, it has the possibility of just widening the chasm between the discord between the parent that they're being alienated from and that child. So the impact, it's devastating. The children continue to be harmed. The parents lose precious time that they can never get back. And the system, it's left unintentionally reinforcing the abuse. So until it's recognized as a clinical issue, and this is something I feel extremely strong about, I've witnessed firsthand a multitude of times, professionals across healthcare, mental health, and family law, unless all these people are properly trained, families, they're going to keep falling through the cracks.
Critically, many parts of this question you already answered now, but how can professionals due to this very lack of understanding, unintentionally enable alienation, leading to even further harm?
Well, I mean, often they don't recognize it for what it is, so they unintentionally become a part of the problem. So a well-meaning therapist or a custody evaluator or even a judge might take that child's rejection of a parent at face value, assuming it reflects the child's authentic feelings. But in reality, those feelings may have been shaped by manipulation, by fear, and by loyalty pressure. And what they do is they validate the rejection because of who they are, and they're esteemed, their position in society, and it just it amplifies that child's rejection because they think, well, if the judge or the therapist or they're agreeing with what I'm saying, even though I'm not completely sure of why I'm saying it, I guess I'm doing the right thing. And the professional essentially they just reinforce the alienation. So, for example, I've seen therapists encourage a child to set boundaries with the targeted parent, when in fact the child's resistance was already being coached. I've seen courts order equal responsibility in co-parenting, ignoring the fact that the one parent was actively engaged in coercive control. So, I've seen, and myself, I've been labeled as angry or reactive simply because I was desperately trying to protect the bond with my child. And what I'll say is this is how it deepens, the alienation deepens, because the abuser who is in control, and that's within their personality disorder, that's what they, for them, it's much more crucial for them to have control of their children and control of their ex than for their child to be happy. And it's really the parent or the party that is inflicting the alienation. The first and foremost concern they have is keeping and sustaining the control they have of those children, not how that child is how this is going to impact them, how it's going to how that child's psychological well-being is. It's not a consideration. That is second or third on the list, if at all. So instead of breaking the cycle, the system, what happens is it unintentionally validates it. And the secondary harm is being disbelieved, dismissed, or blamed by professionals. And it can be just as devastating as the alienation itself.
I understand. There's also, talking about the labels, the danger of mislabeling alienated parents as bitter or obsessed. So how do you feel these labels prevent getting support?
I mean, calling an alienated parent bitter obsessed is like blaming a drowning person for a thrashing in the water and trying to, come up for air. It just misses the whole point. Labels like bitter or obsessed, they're incredibly harmful. They make a protective parent look unreasonable instead of recognizing them, that their persistence comes from love and desperation. So once those labels stick, professionals stop listening. They dismiss the parent's concerns as emotional drama rather than red flags of abuse. And silencing, it prevents real understanding, real intervention, and real support for that parent. In truth, those parents, they're not bitter. They're heartbroken. They aren't obsessed. They're fighting for their children. And those labels, they only serve to hide the real abuse of what's actually occurring.
Marisa, as we wrap up here, you've said very powerfully that if you can't name it, if you can't put a name toward it in the healthcare system and legally, then you can't prevent it. And can you emphasize to our listeners why naming and recognizing parental alienation is so critically important?
Yeah, of course. I've said before, if you can't name it, you can't prevent it, you can't mitigate it, and you can't help those who need the most help. It's true not just in parental alienation, but obviously in medicine, in law, and in society. We don't treat diseases we don't recognize. We don't create laws for harms we don't define and identify. And we can't protect children from something we refuse to call it by its name. So parental alienation, it thrives in silence and it thrives in misunderstanding. So when professionals, they don't name it, it gets dismissed as conflict or custody issues. And when families can't name it, they feel isolated. like what they're experiencing, it's not real. And when children can't name it, they carry confusion, they carry guilt into adulthood without understanding what was done. And naming it, I do believe it's the first step to breaking that cycle. Once we recognize alienation for what it is, as child abuse and coercive control, we can train professionals to spot it, courts to address it, communities to support families who are experiencing it. Without recognition, parents and children, they'll continue to be re-traumatized by the systems that minimize the reality that they constantly seek for support that they're not getting. So it validates the survivors, naming it. For parents, it's the difference between feeling silenced and feeling seen. And for children, it's the difference between carrying shame and reclaiming their truth. Recognition opens the door to prevention, healing, and ultimately hope, I believe.
Marisa, thank you. Truly, thank you for defining such a complex and devastating phenomenon with such clarity. It's evident that understanding is indeed the first step, allowing people to stop normalizing it or dismissing it as something less than it is. This conversation provides crucial language for those who felt lost and alone in their experience. So tune in and know that you are not alone.